the Western Climate Initiative that has been introduced by a number of states and provinces in North America in the sort of cap and trade carbon compliance area. So in British Columbia government has developed something called the Pacific Carbon Trust, which has been endowed with a certain amount of money to go out and purchase carbon offsets for retirement by public service organizations in British Columbia. Now, all of the projects must be located in British Columbia, but the Pacific Carbon Trust certainly has created a market for carbon credits in British Columbia because they have cash to purchase credits, and also they're looking at a price of up to $25 a ton, although most of the carbon credit purchase agreements that have been entered into are not quite at the $25, but there is that potential. I had mentioned to you the Western Climate Initiative. This is an initiative of a number of U.S. states, most notably California, and 4 Canadian provinces. And this is scheduled to be launched in 2012. And if it did, primarily because of the participation of California, it would create quite a robust carbon market in North America. And all signs seem to be that California is still in for the duration. So, so far so good. Alberta has actually had a system in place since 2007, and so there has been a market in Alberta since that time. And so that's and again, the Alberta system is focused on projects in Alberta. So the Alberta market is restricted to local projects, and Saskatchewan recently introduced legislation similar to that in Alberta. So there is a bit of a regulatory market in North America. The voluntary markets are always a possibility wherever you are in Canada, and probably the most popular standard right now is the voluntary carbon standard. So you could, if you have a project anywhere in Canada, you could bring it within one of the protocols developed under the voluntary carbon standard, and then you would have credits that you could sell in the voluntary markets. So you've got the voluntary markets as a possibility for purchasers. You've got opportunities in British Columbia, the Pacific Carbon Trust. You've got the compliance markets in Alberta and also emerging in Saskatchewan. Potential opportunities next year under the Western Climate Initiative, should it go ahead, and as I said, the voluntary markets. So just a few issues related to developing carbon projects in First Nations communities. I know my partner, actually, Rob Miller, spoke on this a couple of weeks ago, and some of you may have heard his presentation where he went into this whole area in a lot more detail than I am going to today. But essentially, First Nations communities who are facing a potential carbon project always have to get over this initial hurdle, or this has been my experience. They're always looking at whether these investments, payments, this concept of commoditizing carbon, if that somehow weakens customary rights, access to land, natural resources, how that basically impacts any kind of Aboriginal title negotiations that are taking place with respect to, the federal government or the provincial government. So that's always seems to be sort of one of the first issues that get discussed. And related to that, I guess, is always this issue of who owns the carbon. Because, in Canada and North America and internationally, there are no legal regimes for who owns the carbon, say, separate from trees or in trees, for example, in the forestry sector. So often, and just to back up a little bit, a lot of First Nations communities have been looking at forestry projects, and sorry, I just jumped right into the forestry projects, but often the issue comes up as who owns the land, who owns the carbon, and what are the rights to the carbon, say in the forestry concept. This is also an issue on reserves or in First Nations communities with respect to different kinds of projects, right? So if you implement a run-of-the-river, even a renewable project or a energy efficiency in a housing context, who owns those credits, and can the community, in fact, sell the credits? And this is an issue because any kind of buyer, whether the buyer is in the voluntary area or in the compliance area, want to know that they're getting good title to these carbon credits. And so in the First Nations context, you have all of the issues around carrying on business on reserve lands, and you have all those same issues in the carbon context as well. So essentially, you have the same issues about who gets the proceeds, who has an interest in the project, is the project economically feasible, that sort of thing. Now, there are obviously trading opportunities for First Nations communities. There are buyers out there. If you get through, the issues that I just articulated to some extent in the previous slide, there are opportunities. It's a new source of revenue. So when you're looking at, for example, in the forestry sector, there are opportunities to monetize essentially a natural resource that obviously a lot of First Nations communities have access to. So there's a potential for revenues. There's also an opportunity to clarify rights to trees, to carbon, and so some communities have seen this as an opportunity to essentially, draw a line in the sand with respect to carbon and not sort of allow provincial governments or federal governments to come in and, designate other potential owners of that carbon aside from the community. There's also an opportunity in the context of a particular project, whether that's a wind farm or it's a forestry project, to develop local knowledge and expertise in terms of developing, managing the project. So there are a number of communities across Canada who have got into the project development business, monitoring, say, in the wind farm context or in a forestry project, and even to the extent of verifying carbon credits. So it has been an economic development opportunity in that respect as well. Also, in Canada and internationally, First Nations sort of foray into this area has allowed them to commence a participation in international discussions about who owns the trees, who owns the carbon, and you've seen this in the context of the development of so-called RED projects internationally. So it has been an opportunity for political participation of Aboriginal peoples, locally and internationally. So carbon financing options for First Nation communities. So there's a number of options. In many respects, or really in all respects, the same options, which actually Susan went through some of them in her presentation, that are available to anyone in Canada in the clean tech area or in this area, are open to First Nations communities. Now, in some respects and in some occasions, it's more difficult to implement some of these because of issues relating to title and reserve lands and that kind of thing, but they're generally available. So you have the traditional debt, you borrow money or issue debt securities, equity, you create a company, you go out and raise capital through selling shares, or if it's a limited partnership, selling units in a limited partnership. A number of government programs out there, not always so easy to access that money, but a number of government programs out there. And then there are potential for joint venture arrangements where where the community partners with